Learned about the beginning. In Genesis, we learned about the creation. We learned about God. We learned about man. We learned about the promise that God made to Abraham in Genesis 12 and the beginning of the effects of that promise. Exodus, we read of the people of Israel who had gone into Egypt with Joseph, now numbering to probably the millions. And of course, their exodus from the confines of the Egyptians and the eventual defeat of the army of the Egyptians. One of the things that I want us to think about, going back to Genesis 12, there's a twofold promise that is there. The first promise is that of a great nation. What is necessary for there to be a nation? Well, first of all, there has to be people. And in the book of Exodus, you see the numbers of the Jews increasing to those kinds of numbers that it would take to be a nation. Secondly, you need law. In the book of Exodus, we have the giving of the law of Moses. So now we're 2/3 there of having a great nation. In the book of Leviticus, we have that law discussed. We have the sacrifices reiterated, and they were reminded of the sacrifices. They discussed, of course, the type of worship God expected and the kind of worship He condemned. So we have now this period of the wilderness wanderings. And we have the period of wilderness wanderings because you have this young nation that is yet a nation that has no land. They have law, they have the people, but they have no land. And we find out in the book of Numbers why they don't have the land. And we find out in the book of Numbers what was happening during that period of time that they had to literally wander in the wilderness. And I think it's interesting that in the geography of the area they wandered was called the wilderness of Zin. Spelled two ways, Z-I-N, but also S-I-N. I like the S-I-N better because of the decisions that they made. So when we talk about Numbers, we're talking about basically the preparation for going on into the land of promise. Now, turn to Numbers chapter 6. Numbers chapter 6, verses 24 through 26. Listen to this passage. To me, this is one of the key passages of the book because it talks about the kind of God they served. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make His face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up His countenance upon you and give you peace. Does that verse sound familiar to anyone? It's a song. The song is, well, we refer to it as the sevenfold Amen. And this is where that song originated. It is Scripture. But notice, the Lord bless you and keep you, make His face to shine upon you, and give you peace. What more could a Christian, what more could any man or woman ask for than that? All right, now, let's look at some background information. In the Hebrew, the word bimadar represented the wilderness. And it's interesting to me, and I don't really get the connection, but in the Greek, it was not translated bimadar, it was translated arithmoi, where we get our arithmetic, our numbers. So the Greek translated it different than, of course, the Hebrew. there's two numberings of the people. The first numbering was when they came out of Egypt at Mount Sinai. If you recall in your history, there's over 603,000 men above 20 that came out of Egypt. Now that's significant because the men over 20, 603,000 to be exact, 550 men above the age of 20. They counted the men that were of fighting age. That didn't count the women, it didn't count the children, and it didn't count the older people. When they reached the plains of Moab after the wandering period, they had another count. That's after that generation had died, because that's what God said would happen. After that generation had died, and now there's 601,730 men, all above the age of 20. Now again, that's only men above the age of 20, men that are fighting age. It is estimated that there were over 3 to 4 million people that was in the wilderness wandering. 3 to 4 million people. Can you imagine the logistics of trying to take care and lead 3 to 4 million people? Can you imagine the job that Moses had on his shoulders? That's why his father-in-law suggested you need to get some help, and you need to appoint some men as elders and some judges to help you to lead and make decisions with all these people. You can't do it efficiently by yourself. That's Jackson's paraphrase. And so he did exactly that. But after 40 years of wandering, it was down a little bit to 601,000 men. Now, the book of Numbers contains the events that happened during that 38 years. And by the way, we're into 2 years of the wandering. Okay, when Numbers starts, we're into 2 years of the wanderings. So it deals with the 38 years of the children of Israel wandering in the wilderness. And it does several things. First of all, the book will explain why they had to wander. It explains a lot about the people, and then it explains a lot of the things that happened while they wandered in the wilderness. First of all, why did they wander in the wilderness? Now, in chapter 13 and verse 2, God promises them to give them the land. Notice this comment from God. Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, watch this, which I am giving to the children of Israel. From each tribe of their fathers you shall send a man, everyone a leader among them. Here's the promised land. Okay, they've got law, they've got people, they don't have land. And God said, here's the land I'm going to give you. You're going to be a great nation. You got to have land. Here's the land. I am giving it to you. Send spies. One from each of the 12 tribes. That's why there are 12 spies. Now, what was their job? To see if they were able to take the land? No. That wasn't their job. Their job was to verify that that land was exactly as God promised, a land flowing with milk and honey. God said, I will give you the land. The land was theirs. All they had to do was take the land. Now, we know what happened. When the 12 returned, they verified everything God said. It is indeed a land flowing with milk and honey. And they even literally had to pull out the produce to show how fruitful this land was. It was everything God said. And God told them, I will give you this land. But that three-letter word gets a lot of people in trouble. But these 10 spies said, the people, they are strong. Then here come Joshua and Caleb. They said, well, we are well able to overcome it. Again, they understood what God had told them. They understood that they weren't going to that land to see if they could take it. Those 10 faithless spies took it on themselves to determine if they could take it or not. Joshua and Caleb went over there to see the land and its beauty and its fruitfulness. And it was exactly what God promised. And he said, with God giving it to us, we are well able to take the land. You know, I can hear them. What are we waiting for, guys? But here is exactly what they said. Notice this. This is something, you know, isn't it amazing how you read something and read it and you read it and you miss it. And then all of a sudden it pops up. Notice what they say. They say, we were like grasshoppers in our own sight. And we were in their sight. All the times I preached this before, I said, we were like grasshoppers in their sight, but that's not what it says. We were grasshoppers in our own sight. What were they saying? We aren't strong enough to take it. Oh, wait a minute. I guess God's not involved in this picture. I guess God didn't promise to give them the land. I guess they thought that responsibility was on their shoulders. We're just like grasshoppers in our sight and in theirs. I had a teacher whenever I was at Preston Road call that the grasshopper complex. Sometimes even in the church today, we have the grasshopper complex. There's a lot of things we think we can't do because of numbers, especially smaller congregations. They have this littleness type mentality. That's not what pleases God. We are to be His servants. 2 Corinthians 5 verse 7, Paul said, for we walk by sight and not faith. If you don't get up and fire me right now, you want me to correct it? Okay, I'll correct it. For we walk by faith and not by sight. You see, they were walking by sight. Paul reminded the Christians of Corinth we're supposed to be walking by faith. The only two in that whole scenario walking by faith was Joshua and Caleb. Now, after hearing about these giants in the land from these 10 spineless spies, the people began to wail on Joshua and Caleb to the point of threatening to kill them because they wouldn't change their mind. And all they were doing was repeating what God told them. Well, what they didn't understand is this was an insult to God. This was a faithless insult to God. And so God said, this perverse generation will die in the wilderness. Your sons will go into this land, but you won't. So because of their faithlessness, the only two above the age of 20, and that generation that would be allowed to go into the promised land would be Joshua and Caleb. The others would die because of their faithlessness. That's why they had to wander in that wilderness for 40 years. In Romans 11, verse 22, therefore consider the goodness and severity of God on those who fell, severity. But towards you, goodness, if you continue in His goodness, otherwise you also be cut off. What's Paul talking about? Paul is talking about some of these very events we're going to be looking at tonight in the book of Numbers. In the book of Numbers, we see the goodness and severity of God. We've got to understand that these two natures of God. A lot of people focus on God as a God of love. He is. But there's another side of God. He is a God of severity. To those who do not obey Him, He is severe in His punishments. To those who obey Him, He is loving and kind and good to them. Okay, now, let's look at the goodness of God in this book. First of all, He provided leadership. You know, Moses may have been the one that instructed Israel, but it was God that led them by fire during the day and a pillar of cloud of smoke at night. He led them on this journey. You know, we probably haven't thought about this, but they were in a strange land. They had been basically in Egypt for all their lives. Now they've escaped Egypt. They are wandering in the wilderness that they've never been in. So where was their guideship? Right there in God. So they could follow God. God was their leader. He provided their physical needs. Now, you know, when we have our monthly meals here, we have some good cooks, don't we? And we're cooking for maybe 75 people, just guessing off the top of my head. Now I want you to think about this. Feeding 75 people. We are talking about 3 to 4 million people that needed to eat. How could the wilderness, you know, this is something, one of the questions by skeptics is, how could just that wilderness provide enough sustenance to support 3 to 4 million people? The answer is, it couldn't. God did it. God did it. He provided the manna, the bread. And He also provided the quail to eat. He provided salvation because of the fiery serpents that were sent during the rebellion. Men were dying. When they repented and turned to God in obedience, He raised a brazen serpent that if they looked upon that brazen serpent, they might live. There is another that said, if I be lifted up from the earth, I will draw all men to me. I wonder who said that. That's right, Jesus Christ. Like that serpent brought salvation to those that would look upon it that had been bitten by the poisonous snakes. So we look up at Christ for our salvation. Now, by the way, notice the effort. What if I had been bit by one of those fiery serpents, but my pride wouldn't let me look at that brazen serpent that had been raised in the wilderness? What would happen to me? Yes, sir. I'd die. A horrible death, by the way. Same with Jesus Christ. We have to make that effort. And of course, that effort involves our obedience to Him. So He provides salvation to those who need it. In chapters 21 through 23, they run into a battle situation with the king of Sihon. And they go into battle. By God's power, they overcome the nation of Sihon, or Sihon, however you want to pronounce it. And then, in chapter 35, he does something interesting. He appoints 6 cities of refuge. How many of you know what a city of refuge is? Okay, well, that's good. Most people do. The city of refuge was established 3 on one side of the Jordan, 3 on the other. They're getting ready to go into Jordan now whenever this is written. So in their preparation, God appointed 6 cities, 3 on either side of the Jordan. If there is an altercation and a man accidentally kills another man, and the family members of the one that was killed takes revenge upon the one who did the killing, then he could flee to one of the cities of refuge and stay there until his trial, and they couldn't touch him. It was for their safety, to get them to a place where they could be tried. You know, they had kind of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth kind of deal working. So this gave the one who had committed the accidental manslaughter, we'll call it, the chance to escape until trial, until he had a hearing for the actions that he had taken. And no one could touch him in these cities. And there were 6 of them. Did you know in the temple, on the altar, there were 4 horns? You could also escape and go into the court where the altar was. And if you grab a hold of the horns of the altar, you were spared, you were safe. Just thought I'd throw that out. There were places of refuge that God did signify for the safety of those that needed it. But now we want to look at the severity of God. God is not always a loving God. He's always a loving God. Let me take that back. He's always a loving God. But sometimes that love is quite severe. You want to talk about tough love? We hear that a lot today in our society. Well, let me tell you, God has tough love. In chapter 11, 31 through 35, the people took advantage of the quail and the manna, and they gathered the quail and they started lining it up for themselves. God had said, you just need to get enough for one meal, or for one, your family, for one day, and leave the rest alone. And they had gathered all this quail up. As a result of their disobedience and their rebellion, a plague came upon them, and he ended up causing them many to die right there. And that place was called Kibroth Hattaavah, a place of death. Now, in verse 33 of chapter 11, this is something you might want to turn over there. This is interesting to me. Let me get the setup. And the people, verse 32, stayed up all that day, all night, and all the next day, and gathered the quail. He who gathered least gathered 10 homers. And they spread them out for themselves all around the camp. Watch this. But while the meat, I love the way he says this, but while the meat was yet in their teeth, they're still chewing, the Lord's wrath was aroused against the people and struck them with a very great plague. Right in the middle of taking their second bite, he struck them with a plague, and many of them died. Miriam and Aaron got a little bit jealous over Moses, approached Moses, basically said, "Aren't we prophets just like you?" But you see, Moses, and this is where we find that Moses is a humble man above all men. You know who called him out? It wasn't Moses. God called him out. Miriam, Aaron, come out. Come out of the temple, or out of the tabernacle. Come out. How can you talk to the prophet of God like you have just spoken to my servant Moses? I speak to other prophets through visions. I speak through Moses face to face. No other prophet like my servant Moses. As a result of that, Miriam, boy, I bet Miriam sure hated she ever brought this subject up. Now she is smitten with leprosy. That horrible disease that would cause her to be removed from the camp. Just like a bunch of faithless individuals, the camp of Israel murmured and complained. All Moses heard was murmuring and complaining. All God heard was their complaining. We've been brought out of Egypt. We're going to die. Oh, woe is me. Everything's bad. I'll eat worms. That's the way their attitude was. What about our attitudes today? Do we have a little bit of a complaining spirit? Do we murmur? Well, I want to just submit this to you tonight. These people in their complaining and murmuring showed a lack of faith. God had been taking care of them, and yet they still murmured and complained. God reminded them again, because of this complaining, everyone above 20 would die in the wilderness. At Korah, there was a great rebellion against Moses, against God, chapter 16. And the earth opened up and swallowed the people. Of course, we already alluded to chapter 21 was the fiery serpents, again because of their rebellion, because of their complaints. Now, you want to know how severe God is? God was providing water for Israel. You know, it's one thing to think about Moses walking up to a big boulder and hitting a rock and a little stream of water comes out. But, you know, I got to thinking about that. That would be fine if it was for 4, 5, 10, 12 people, isn't it? How much volume of water would have had to come from that for 3 to 4 million? Did you ever think about that? If it was just a trickle of water, a stream of water, how long would they have been there trying to get everyone satisfied? There'd be some of them probably died of thirst before they could ever get a drink. The volume of water. All right, let me get back to my point. Here, God commands Moses, his prophet, you speak to that rock. Moses, because of his anger, not at God, but because of his anger to the people, took his rod and he smote the rock. He hit it. Well, you know, God gave him the water. But you know what Moses had just done? Folks, Moses disobeyed God. God's servant, the most humble man, disobeyed the Heavenly Father. Now we see God's severity. Moses, you shall not be allowed to go into that promised land. You'll be able to see it. You'll be able to climb the heights of Mount Pisgah and to look over into the valley and see this land. But Moses, you won't be going over. Just because he hit the rock instead of speaking to it. Folks, God is not narrow-minded, but He means what He said. He has always meant what He said. If He tells us in worship to sing, He means we are to sing. If He tells us we are to be baptized for salvation, that means we are to be baptized for our salvation. How could you misread 1 Peter 3, verse 21? If we are to worship on the first day of the week, then folks, we are to worship on the first day of the week. And the list goes on and on. What God says, what He has commanded, we are required to do. Moses proved God's faithfulness to His word. Because of Moses' sin, he would be kept out of the promised land. As sad, very sad as that is, that's the severity of God. They wandered 40 years because of their faithlessness. Turn to Hebrews chapter 3. How did God view their actions in the wilderness? Now, in the New Testament, the writer of Hebrews refers back to their wilderness wanderings and looks at them and examines the wanderings. Now notice verse 8. How did he view their actions? Well, first of all, he called it acts of rebellion. They rebelled against him. Verse 8, they were basically putting God on trial. Now look at verse 10. Because of their rebellion and because that they put him on trial, I was angry with that generation and said, they always go astray in their heart. They have not known my ways. From the very beginning, their hearts is revealed. Whenever they're telling Moses, we can't take the land because of the giants, and we're but grasshoppers in our sight and in theirs. You see a glimpse into their hearts. They are faithless. They're spineless. And rather than owning their sin, they murmured and complained for 38 years. Rather than trying to cooperate with God, they fought Him for 38 years. And he said, I was angry with them. Don't fight God. You won't win. Numbers teaches us that. They always go astray in their heart, and they have not known my ways because they've not chosen to know His ways. Hebrews 3 verses 16 through 19. Watch this. For who, having heard, rebel? Indeed, was it not all who came out of Egypt? In God's estimation, all who came out of Egypt rebelled. Even though they were led by Moses, it didn't matter. Now with whom was He angry for 40 years? That's a long time to be angry, isn't it? But that's a long time for these people to fight against God too. Was it not with those who sinned, whose corpses fell in the wilderness? God meant what He said. Stop murmuring, stop complaining, stop rebelling, stop putting me on trial. Because they didn't, they would die. Their corpses would rot there in that wilderness. And to whom did He swear that they would not enter His rest? Watch this. But to those who did not what? Obey. Obey. Moses didn't obey. He could only from Mount Pisgah watch and see and look into that land flowing milk and honey. Because he didn't obey. He disobeyed God. These hundreds of thousands of Jews over the age of 20 would die, corpses rot in the wilderness because they disobeyed. Now notice what he goes on to say. So we see that they could not enter in, not only because they didn't obey, because they didn't believe. Why didn't they obey? Because they didn't believe. It all started, you go back to the very beginning. God said, I'll give you the land, and they said, we can't take the land because we're but grasshoppers in our sight. They didn't believe from the very beginning. They were a faithless people. Therefore, they were a disobedient people. And they would die in the wilderness. There would be a new generation, a new people that would go into the land of promise. Just in conclusion, some what I think valuable lessons, besides the one we've already kind of mentioned. There is no insignificant sin. You remember the series I preached several years ago about respectable sins, that we look at some sins, maybe not quite in the same idea of seriousness as we do others. We learn in Numbers there's no insignificant sin. Moses, when he struck the rock, is a proof of that. A man was gathering sticks on the Sabbath. Well, what's wrong with that? He violated the Sabbath. What happened to him? He was struck dead. The rebellion of Korah, the earth swallowed them. There is no insignificant sins. Sin is sin. The wages of sin is death. Beware of covetousness. Now here's a name that we didn't talk about, but I'm just going to briefly mention Balaam. We've discussed Balaam before. Balaam was a man that was a prophet, but he was very greedy. And in order to get more, he compromised. And he compromised to get gain. To get gain. So we see we've got to beware of covetousness, like Balaam was a covetous man. We see what God expects of His servants. I love what the Bible says about Joshua. Look at chapter 14 and verse 24. 14 verse 24. Now, what really makes this special is this is what God says about Caleb. God saying this. Don't you pray that God could say this about you and me? But my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit and has followed me fully, underline fully. In every detail, he followed God. I will bring into the land where he went, and his descendants shall inherit it. Why did he get to go in the land when the others didn't? Because, number one, he was a servant of God. Number two, he had a different spirit. You see, God's servants have a different spirit. We're not like anyone else. We find out he wasn't like the other Jews, his brethren. He wasn't like them. He had a different spirit. And he followed God fully. Therefore, he was going to be allowed to go into the land of promise and inherit it with his descendants. The cities of refuge. We mentioned that briefly a while ago, and this lesson will be years after this. Only in the city of refuge could one find safety and protection. We have a city of refuge today. In this city of refuge is called Mount Zion, the New Jerusalem, the bride of Christ, the church, where a man who has sinned can flee and by the obedience to the will of God can find refuge and safety and salvation. I don't believe it's by accident that these cities of refuge were appointed. I believe these to be a shadow of the church. Tonight I would encourage you to look at these things, study them. You know, the more I read these books and look at them and kind of discover these lessons, the more excited I